Now, there's been much discussion about the AN-ACC assessment process and what is actually within control of the providers, and what is left to the independent assessment workforce that will be assessing our residents. Now, to explore this further, let's revisit how our business processes for revenue management works today and into the future. As was widely documented through the Royal Commission's hearings, the ACFI rewards those organizations who can invest in their internal ACFI processes. Now, this typically comes in the form of extra hours for ACFI coordinators, dedicated RN or enrolled nurses to focus on documentation alignment, and even a specific investment in resources such as OT and physios to deliver the required procedures in which are optimized under a resident's claim through the ACFI. Now, for a start, the ACFI assessment process is managed in-house by providers and requires a coordinated effort of activities across site-based team members, which is mostly managed on-site by the ACFI coordinator. Now, the coordinator effort building up the clinical evidence within each ACFI claim can take between 8 to 12 hours of elapsed time, and it's typically worked on over a duration of a few weeks. However, at the beginning of each funding process, whether it is ACFI or in the new world, ANAC, it requires an individual on the provider side to understand the funding model framework and to initiate the start of an appraisal process. We have noted this step as claim identification and planning. Step 1. The ACFI process and the soon-to-be ANAC process both begins with claim identification and planning. This step of the process is where providers utilize our revenue reporting tools such as Mirror's metrics to assess the current activities which Medicare is funding against what they know is happening at their site today. Now, where it is identified that new clinical activities are now being provided for the consumer, which is not included in what Medicare is funding today, then that would be sufficient evidence to seek a voluntary appraisal, or commonly known as a funding uplift. The mandatory claiming processes is also the same, but it's largely governed by the business rules, which sets out when a claim must be submitted. Now, for a provider to be able to make that call as to when to initiate an appraisal, providers and their teams will need a complete understanding of the funding instrument, be it ACFI or ANAC. Once the process commences under the ACFI process, providers must invest in the time to prepare, populate, and capture data from the specific funding-led assessments we are familiar with, such as 7-day behavioral charts, 3 and 7-day continence charts, PAS, Cornell's for depression, and so on. Then much of the time following the completion of the ACFI assessments will be spent on aligning current care plans and functional assessments to the relevant outcome of the new claim. Now, as the clinical assessments come back from the floor, the funding manager, or ACFI coordinator in this instance, will review the clinical assessments for alignment to the desired claim, typically referred to as congruent checking. Now, depending on the quality of the outputs coming back to the ACFI coordinators from the wider clinical teams, this step may take a considerable amount of time as providers seek to ensure they are mitigating any gaps in evidence or incongruences, which would put the claim at risk of a downgrade in the validation process. Now, we also know that the custodianship of clinical documentation is largely managed by the funding teams because their work output can be scrutinized against each claim that an organization makes to Medicare. Now, once the ACFI coordinator feels they have managed the relevant clinical evidence or the claim is due for a submission under a mandatory claim rules, the ACFI assessment details are then submitted to Medicare and the new claim takes effect from the time it is stamped in the system. In the old saying, time is money, that is certainly the case with ACFI, as each day that passes before a new ACFI submission is made is effectively a foregone entitlements which the provider will have to cover themselves. So time is always of the essence with ACFI. So at the point in time the provider submits their claim to Medicare, Medicare provides an accepted outcome with the new timestamp referred to as the appraisal start date. And the payment statement for that month will then be modified once the RAC finalizes their monthly claim statements. The actual count of paid bed days with the old claim versus the new claim is then paid and reported back to the business, and this is typically reconciled in the month-end finance processes. This process continually plays out each day across our sector at a considerable administrative cost to the sector. Now, to put the effort of this process into context, if you are a 1,000-bed provider, this process plays out around 100 times a month as we report total claiming activity of 10% of their resident total population, of which normally voluntary claiming contributes to around 3 to 4% of that total. So if each claim takes between 8 to 12 hours of elapsed clinical effort, that is anywhere between 800 to 1,200 hours of administrative activity, which will no longer be required under the outsourced assessment model of AN-ACC. In the new world of AN-ACC, providers will still be required to understand how AN-ACC is determined so that they can forecast the likely assessment outcomes in the form of a case mix alignment across their entire resident population. This will be the new challenge of the AN-ACC coordinators, to understand the rules of AN-ACC engagement within the outsourced assessment model. Now, one additional factor for AN-ACC is that AN-ACC coordinators will need to identify and plan out their residents who can now either be assessed up for more funding or assessed down, as AN-ACC will require a new approach of claiming, which brings the adjusted case mix of required minutes into the equation. So tools such as Mirror's metrics, which many providers use to identify and plan out their claiming activities, will be even more relied upon, as providers will still have to manage historical ACFI evidence and desktop validations well past the changeover to AN-ACC, as well as to provide their target AN-ACC outcomes before requesting an independent AN-ACC assessment. Now, if we put our attention to the AN-ACC process, the AN-ACC coordinators will still need to work through the residents and will be utilizing reports and Mirror's metrics data to target new claim outcomes in which they forecast. In the AN-ACC world, specific pieces of clinical evidence such as falls history reports, independent assessments from physios or other specialists, and other relevant case notes will be relied upon to identify and target likely funding and minute outcomes for their organizations. These clinical notes will form the basis of a new AN-ACC pack, which will support the desired funding position being sought by the provider. These packs will also provide assurance to the wider business stakeholders that the forecasted AN-ACC outcome could be met. Now, the planned AN-ACC outcome will be a user-defined forecast input in which the business analysts of providers can utilize to model some of the decisions in which they need to consider for their case mix adjusted rosters. This user-defined information will then be utilized by the provider to run the scenarios amongst their business analyst teams to determine rostering adjustments associated with any of the new admissions or planned AN-ACC outcomes. Now, an example of what that decision framework would look like for a provider would follow the lines of this. As a provider, do I keep my roster demand template, but then admit the higher predicted case mix outcomes, but then also seek a downward review of the 2 in situ forecasted residents that are now below their current paid AN-ACC in order to balance out our requirements for the adjusted 200 mix case mix average. Now, once the AN-ACC coordinator in the business makes a call on the desired scenario for the RAC, the provider will then request an appraisal for the desired outcome. Now, as the AN-ACC process is an independent assessment, steps 2 to 4 are not required for providers to manage. Therefore, most of that administrative time and burden can be released back into the business and to the floor teams to manage residents or other activities on the floor. Now, Mirror's metrics will support the inputs of the user-defined outcomes, as well as collection of the AN-ACC information that will be relied upon to give the business the assurance that the outcome is there, as well as to help influence the outcome of the desired AN-ACC by the independent assessment team.